We are now less than 4,000 miles away from the moon. Actually, 3,900 to be exact, traveling at 876 miles per hour. We are 1 hour and 12 minutes away from the outbound powered flyby burn, scheduled for 7:44 a.m. Eastern Time. Everything on track for the burn this morning. At closest approach after the burn, we will be just 80 miles above the lunar surface. Again, this is an uncrewed flight test. We have no astronauts aboard the Artemis I mission. We're doing this mission in preparation for astronauts to fly aboard for Artemis II and our future missions in the Artemis program. Now 1 hour from the outbound powered flyby maneuver, targeted for 7:44 a.m. Eastern Time. Orion is 3,300 miles away from the moon, traveling 1,025 miles per hour. Thanks for joining us for our live coverage this morning. This is a live view from a camera on the tip of Orion's solar array wing, aimed at our destination, the moon. We are now 3,098 miles away from the moon, traveling at 1,085 miles per hour, just 56 minutes away from the outbound powered flyby. That outbound powered flyby is targeted for 7:44 a.m. Eastern Time. We're happy to have brought you this extended coverage this morning, and for now, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Sandra Jones, to take you all the way through outbound powered flyby.
We're continuing to bring you live coverage of the upcoming outbound powered flyby of Orion, now scheduled for 53 minutes and 30 seconds from now. Orion is already in the moon's sphere of influence, and yesterday the team completed a successful outbound trajectory correction burn. This burn helps set us up for the OPF burn, again coming up in about 53 minutes from now. At the time of the OPF burn, Orion will be 328 statute miles above the moon. And then just a short time from then, Orion will complete its closest approach to the moon at 81 miles above the lunar surface. Now, during this time, we will not have signal with Orion because it will be traveling behind the backside of the moon. However, we expect to regain communications once Orion swings back around to the other side and is back on the deep space network. The outbound powered flyby will send Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into what we call a distant retrograde orbit. Following this, Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for one long elliptical orbit around the moon, lasting about 6 days. Now, this orbit is called distant due to the high altitude from the moon. It's about 40,000 miles past the moon in its orbit, which is actually 30,000 miles farther than the previous record set during Apollo 13. And this will be the farthest in space any spacecraft built for humans will have ever flown. This orbit is also called retrograde because Orion will be traveling around the moon opposite the direction the moon travels around the Earth. This DRO provides a highly stable orbit where little fuel is required to stay for an extended trip in deep space in order to put Orion's systems through its paces and to the tests in an environment far from Earth ahead of crewed flights. Here in Mission Control Houston, things remain relatively calm now 5 days, 5 hours since Orion's liftoff aboard the Space Launch System from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The next major milestone that we're tracking ahead of today's burn will be a go-no-go poll where Flight Director Rick LeBrode will poll the team here in Mission Control on key systems required for the upcoming burn. On your screen, you're continuing to get a live view of the moon taken from one of the solar array wing or SAW cameras on board the Orion spacecraft. Orion is traveling at 1,248 miles per hour and is only 2,600 miles away from the moon at this time. Again, upon closest approach, Orion will be about 80 miles off of the surface of the moon. Now, we will be in that anticipated and expected loss of signal during that closest approach. However, we do expect to regain signal with Orion just about 2 minutes after the closest approach, where we will regain communications with the vehicle. If you're just joining us, we're bringing you live coverage of today's upcoming outbound powered flyby burn, which will slingshot us around the backside of the moon. You are continuing to get views of the moon in real time here on your screen from a solar array wing camera on board Orion. Today's burn will take place with the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. This engine has been used several times throughout Orion's 5-day journey to the moon. This is that large engine located on the bottom of the service module. And the engine can provide 6,000 pounds of thrust. Today's burn will last 2 minutes and 30 seconds, but the burn can be used for burns lasting up to 16 minutes in length. The OMS engine on board Orion is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown in space before. It flew on 19 Space Shuttle flights, beginning with STS-41G in October of 1984 and ending with STS-112 in October of 2002. Now, the OMS engine is not the only engine on board the Orion spacecraft. There are also 8 auxiliary engines. These are located on the bottom of the service module as well, but in 4 sets of 2. These are used to provide trajectory corrections and as a backup to the main engine, and each engine provides about 100 pounds of thrust. In total, there are 33 engines aboard Orion, and here on your screen you are getting a quick glimpse of planet Earth. We do expect to regain those videos and imagery here shortly, but for now you're looking at a telemetry-driven animation of Orion and its location. As you can see here on your screen, speed continuing to pick up, now at 1,369 miles per hour. Over 232,000 miles from home, but only 2,000 miles away from the moon. Again, at closest approach will be just over 80 miles above the lunar surface, continuing to close in on the backside of the moon. At this time, we're 15 minutes away from the planned go, no-go poll, where Flight Director Rick LeBrode will poll the team here in Mission Control ahead of today's upcoming outbound powered flyby burn. The outbound powered flyby will send Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit. Following this, Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for one long elliptical orbit around the moon, lasting about 6 days. At this time, Orion is only 1,600 miles away from the moon. And you see this view on your screen as Orion continues to approach the backside of the moon, now traveling at over 1,776 miles per hour. And on the lower middle of your screen, you do see that's us, that's home. 232,000 miles away from Earth. Orion launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida 5 days ago. And we are now 25 minutes away from the outbound powered flyby maneuver. Today's burn will occur with the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, which has been used several times already in Orion's flight. The OMS engine is located on the bottom of the service module and is the largest engine aboard Orion. It can provide 6,000 pounds of thrust and is equipped to help steer the spacecraft and can be used in some abort cases if necessary to safely return Orion to Earth. Now, today's burn will last for 2 minutes and 30 seconds, but the OMS engine can fire for up to 16 minutes. The OMS engine is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown in space several times before, 19 times in fact, beginning on Space Shuttle Flight STS-41G in October of 1984 and ending with STS-112 in October 2002. Now, just about 5 minutes from now, we do expect to lose signal from Orion as it travels behind the moon. That loss of signal will last for 34 minutes. However, once Orion emerges from the backside of the moon and regains communications on the deep space network, we do expect to regain communications with the vehicle. The burn will occur at 6:44 a.m. Central while we are in that loss of signal. And we'll also have the closest approach at that time period when we are in the loss of signal as well. That closest approach at 6:57 a.m. Central, when Orion will be just 81 miles above the lunar surface. Again, if you're just joining us, you are looking at a view from the Solar Array Wing or SAW camera on board the Orion spacecraft, which is 5 days into its mission, just 1,400 miles away from the moon. We'll continue to see the moon grow larger in the frame here in the next couple of minutes before we do lose signal from Orion as it flies behind the moon. Now, you are seeing the Earth, you are seeing home, you are seeing yourself in that image right there, as Orion is 232,000 miles away from planet Earth. Now less than 4 minutes away from our expected loss of signal as Orion travels behind the moon. While behind the moon, Orion will perform the outbound powered flyby, which the team here in Mission Control is ready for. Flight Director Rick LeBrode pulled the team. Everyone is pulling go. Everything still on track for the outbound powered flyby burn, now 20 minutes away. This outbound powered flyby will send Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit. Following this, Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for one long elliptical around the moon, which will last about 6 days. Now, this is different than what was done during the Apollo program when the spacecraft orbited much closer to the moon. Now, this orbit is called distant due to the high altitude from the moon. It's about 40,000 miles past the moon in its orbit. This is actually 30,000 miles farther than the previous record set during Apollo 13 and will be the farthest in space any spacecraft built for humans will have ever flown. This orbit is called retrograde because Orion will travel around the moon opposite the direction the moon travels around Earth. Distant retrograde orbit provides a highly stable orbit where little fuel is required to stay for an extended trip in deep space and allows the opportunity to put Orion's systems to the test in an environment far from Earth. We are now less than 2 minutes away from our anticipated loss of signal as Orion travels behind the moon. As we continue to get live views here for the next minute or so, we will potentially see the Earth start to go just behind the moon as Orion travels behind the moon. We will not have Earth views, of course, because the moon will be blocking the Orion spacecraft. However, we do anticipate an acquisition of signal at 6:59 a.m. Central. It's about a 34-minute loss of signal, at which point we hope to regain communications with the spacecraft. Have confirmation of an acquisition of signal on the Deep Space Network in Goldstone. This view on your screen of planet Earth taken from Orion's Solar Array Wing Camera or SAW camera. Standing on the shoulders of the giants of the Apollo generation, Orion now carries forward the torch of the Artemis generation as it emerges from behind the moon, an Earthrise of our pale blue dot and its 8 billion human inhabitants now coming into view. With the successful acquisition of signal from the Orion spacecraft, the team here in Mission Control Houston will evaluate the spacecraft systems to evaluate performance of the outbound powered flyby burn, which occurred 18 minutes and 50 seconds ago. And you're looking at this view on your screen from the Orion spacecraft as it looks back at planet Earth, having launched just 5 days ago. Orion is now over 230,000 miles away from Earth. Orion emerged from the backside of the moon just minutes ago after completing the outbound powered flyby burn. That burn occurring 21 minutes ago. While behind the moon, Orion completed its closest approach to the moon at a distance of 80 miles above the surface. And you're looking at a live view inside the Orion spacecraft. This is, of course, an uncrewed test flight, but we do have a couple of purposeful passengers that have hopped a ride on board Orion. You're looking at one there on the left of your screen. That is Moonikin wearing the Orion crew survival suit. This is the space suit that crew will wear during dynamic phases of flight once we do have a crew on board, particularly during launch and entry situations. The OX, or Orion Crew Survival Suit, can help keep astronauts alive if Orion were to lose cabin pressure during the journey out to the moon. The OX is equipped to up to 6 days of life support systems as the crew makes their way back to Earth. And as part of this uncrewed test flight, there's a variety of sensors and data that will be pulled from the Orion Crew Survival Suit to inform further design ahead of crewed flight test as part of Artemis II. And this view of our home planet, taken from 229,000 miles away from the Orion spacecraft, following its outbound powered flyby burn behind the moon. At its closest approach, Orion flew 81 miles above the lunar surface. And if you're just joining us, Orion has emerged from the backside of the moon after completing the outbound powered flyby 42 minutes ago. This burn lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds and sent Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit. Once inserted in the distant retrograde orbit, Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for 1/2 elliptical orbit around the moon. This will last about 6 days.